The man I was about to spend the rest of my days with, I'm telling you, he was perfect. There was nothing about him that made me think he was a con artist or just somebody who wasn't who he said he was. Until I met a woman who knew an awfully lot about him, and the one thing that she told me was the biggest red flag ever. She knew something that I thought I was the only one who knew. Love is a beautiful thing. I believed that for the longest of time until this same love became something that almost ruined me. Most people would say your life is not complete without the love of your forever person, but with everything that's going on in my life right now, I'm not so sure about that anymore. My life is unraveling right now because I got caught in a whirlwind romance. Having a good life is everybody's priority, and I took it even more seriously because I did not come from a wealthy family. Growing up, even though my parents tried their best to give me the best life that they could, it still was not enough to get the life that I experienced all around me. My parents had gotten my grandmother's home in a high-class area as her only inheritance, so the most expensive thing we owned was the home. As such, I went to a school full of rich kids who had everything that they asked for. I quickly understood it wasn't the same for me. So, if I wanted to at least have a good life growing up, I had to work hard. And I did. By the time I was 25, I had become a senior associate at my law firm, and I was the youngest person to have done that since the firm was established. I did not stop growing, and by the time I was 30, I had become a partner. That meant a lot of money and a successful career. I was able to live the life I wanted all along, and since all I wanted was for my family and me to enjoy a good life, I wasted no time making their lives easier as well. That included getting new cars from my parents, paying off their debt, as well as reducing their workload. This made my parents happy, and I was in a happy relationship for a long time. This made my parents, especially my mom, ecstatic. She always believed that as a woman, after a good education and a degree, a woman should get married and have babies. She didn't make everything in life about getting married, though, but it was still a part of it, so she was very happy with my ex-boyfriend. I was too, until I wasn't. I met him when I was 25, when my best friend and I had gone out to celebrate my becoming a senior associate. I met Brian at the restaurant, and it wasn't long before we started dating. We had been dating for 5 years, and when I got the offer to buy in as a partner in my law firm, I was overjoyed and told Brian how excited I was about getting the position. I should have noticed then, but I was too happy to advance in my career, and Brian asked if I needed that much money, and I tried to explain that it wasn't like that. However, I did not pay much attention to Brian, especially since it was not the mood that I was looking for. I told Maggie, my best friend, and she was overjoyed. I bought in and became a partner, and I felt very fulfilled. But that spelled the end of my relationship as I knew it. For the last 2 years of my relationship with Brian, so much of what I heard was how I was doing too much and how I made him feel small because of how much I was making. I could have walked away, but guys, I'm telling you, I invested so much of my time, so much of it, right into that relationship. I was already 30. My mother wanted to be a grandma, so she kept pressuring me to get married and have babies. I thought Brian was an in-game option for me until he left me 2 years later, saying he was never going to marry someone who would not be submissive. The situation followed me for so long, and long after I recovered from the heartbreak of Brian leaving, men still left because of the same reason. By the time I reached 40, I just have given up finding somebody who would love me for me and had just thrown myself into work. Well, it paid off incredibly well, and my parents did not even need to work anymore, and they would be perfectly fine. However, all my parents wanted from me was to be grandparents. Every single conversation my mother and I had was centered around marriage and children, and that was all they wanted. Even though I had my life made, I still wanted to please my parents, and I felt that I owed them children at that point. Well, a few months after I turned 40, I met Edward. And guys, the reason I'm even here telling you this story is I'd gone for a meeting with a client when I bumped into old Edward right outside the restaurant. He immediately apologized for bumping into me before telling me,
"Oh, my lord, you're the most beautiful woman I've ever seen."
Edward swept me off my feet. He made me feel like the most important and special person to ever exist. You could call what I experienced a whirlwind romance. We did everything together. Lunches, dinner dates, surprise presents, and picnics, and I experienced something I did not think was possible. Especially since all I've been told was that I had too much money. Edward never made me feel that way. He gifted me amazing things, and I did the same. It did not take long before I realized I had fallen in love with him. We had been dating for 9 months when Edward proposed to me, and he had surprised me with a private, romantic dinner on my 41st birthday. I broke into tears because I didn't think I was going to get proposed to at my age. I was just happy that somebody loved me for who I was. I immediately told everybody I knew that I was getting married. My mother was probably happier than I was, as she kept saying over and over how happy she is, yada yada yada. I felt uncomfortable at the thought, but I was too happy to focus on that. I should have known something was up when Maggie did not share the same excitement. I mean, she was happy that I was happy, but something was off about Edward. She had been saying the same thing since we started dating, but I felt that she was just nothing more than paranoid. I did not let people's opinions stop me from being happy that night. You could tell that I was the happiest person on earth for many days after it, and we began wedding planning and planned to get married within 6 months. Edward had constantly repeated how he could not wait to make me his wife. I told Maggie that whether or not she liked Edward would not stop me from marrying him. I could not plan a wedding without my best friend, so we began planning the wedding earnestly. I asked Edward to come venue shopping with me, but he claimed that whatever I picked was the best bet and that he believed in me.
Well, that made me extremely happy.
And if you had seen me go shopping, you would have seen a woman skipping like a little girl. I found the perfect venue, and I was going to ask Edward to check the venue out with me when he said that he had to travel for a work event. That's when I thought my little perfect life began to crumble. I was at work a few days after Edward traveled when I got the first many anonymous messages. I was writing a proposal to a client when the message came in. It said, "Dear Helen, are you happy with Edward? You should do away with him as soon as you can. He isn't who you really think he is. Just how much do you actually know about him? Don't rush it."
Well, I was surprised that somebody anonymous was saying such things, but I wasn't too bothered.
You might be wondering why Edward charmed me, and I was just completely in love with him, and I could not think that there could be anything wrong with him. So I didn't take it serious, and falling for pranks and scams would have been embarrassing for a woman of my age, right? So I didn't take it serious. Except the anonymous messages just kept coming. I got another one the next day, and it was the same thing. Another of the messages read, "To the woman considering marriage, your choice of a man is horrendous. He's out to ruin you, he doesn't have any good intentions for you, and he will tear your life to shreds. Don't get married to him, no matter the cost." Well, I still refused to take them any bit serious because I just felt that somebody was out to get me. I kept on with the wedding planning because we did not have much time left. I didn't tell anyone either because I didn't think that there was a need to. I never thought that there was any truth to it. Maggie and I had gone to try the menu for the wedding when I received yet another message. I felt very uneasy because I was just told that I was going to have a horrible marriage. I could not keep it in, so I showed Maggie the messages, and she immediately became very suspicious and said that for someone to care enough to constantly send me these messages without demanding anything from me, it meant that something was up. For some reason, I got irritated. I asked Maggie why she didn't want me to be happy. Maggie stood her ground and begged me to slow down, with the wedding preparations until I was sure that these were nothing more than pranks. Well, I slowed down with the wedding preparations at Maggie's request, without letting Edward be suspicious of anything. Especially since I did not believe the messages either. I was at work, as usual, when Maggie stormed into my office in the afternoon. She did not wait to catch her breath before she started saying that she saw Edward with a woman. She had gone to inspect a home that she wanted to buy in another location. When she saw Edward from the restaurant window, he had not seen Maggie, and that was a saving grace.
because maybe he would have twisted the story to be something else. I was surprised because I didn't think that would cause a problem. It could have been somebody from work. However, Maggie said she did not get that feeling. According to Maggie, they looked like they were more than work colleagues. Well, who is this strange mystery woman? Why was Edward with her, and why has Edward not spoken about her? Why did he go so far away from our location to meet her? I had no answers, but that is enough to make me start looking. I mean, what do you guys think I should do? Am I right to feel this type of way? Suspicious? I'll update you guys in a little bit. Update number 1, 4 months later. Hello everyone. It's been 4 months since the last post, and I think my life has gotten worse compared to the last time. The comments I read have held conflicting opinions, and some of you seem to understand my plight really well. I appreciate it, and I remember someone asking if I knew his family. In my defense, he told me that he was estranged from his parents and they had not talked to him in several years. As always, I believed him because I could not imagine Edward ever lying to me. That was way before Maggie told me about the woman that she saw Edward meeting. I was confused, but that just meant that I could ask Edward and he would clear it up. So later, when I went out with Edward for dinner, I asked him who the woman was. He seemed surprised that I knew that he had gone to meet with someone, but it was only for a moment, and he said it was someone who he had been meeting to lobby for a contract. According to him, he didn't say anything, just because he didn't want to jinx his chances. I let it go and thought that there was nothing to worry about anymore. However, as we parted ways and I was walking to my car, I got another anonymous text. The sender told me not to believe a word that little Edward said. The message also read that the woman Edward had gone to meet was not a client at all. She was much, much more to him than that. The sender then told me to go to the place where Edward claimed that he worked and asked about him. I didn't say this before, but Edward said that he worked with a construction company that handled government projects. Among many huge construction projects, I went to the company the next day and asked to see him. To my great surprise, the people I talked to said that they did not know anyone called Edward. Shaken, but not stirred, I left and went to see Maggie immediately. When I explained what had happened to Maggie, she told me not to say anything to Edward and look for a private investigator right now. A part of me felt like I was betraying the man who had been nothing but just good to me. So Maggie insisted that it was better safe than sorry, obviously. I quickly got a private investigator just to find out more about Edward, and what I got in return, well, 3 months almost gave me a heart attack. The private investor, he called me up and asked me to meet him. I brought Maggie along with me, and what that man told me was only the beginning of a can of absolute worms. I found out that Edward was not really Edward. He's Colin. His name is Colin, and he had been married to a woman named Samantha for 6 long years, and guys, that was not all. When the investigator showed Maggie and me a picture of Samantha, Maggie exclaimed and said that it was the same woman she saw Edward with. I broke into tears because I felt betrayed. I mean, how was I getting married to a man who was already married? No, they weren't separated or anything. They were still together, and I didn't think that anything could be worse than what I had already heard. I was wrong. I'll write another update soon for you guys, and I have more to say, but let me just process it. Update number 2. 30 days have passed. I ended the last update by telling you that there was more to what the private investigator found. I would not have ended the story, but the comments were too much to ignore. Well, here it goes. Not only did I almost marry another woman's husband, I almost married a fraud. Over the years, Edward had been called different names. According to the private investigator, meeting Edward was not fate or chance or anything like this at all. He had planned it well, and Edward targeted middle-aged women like myself, single with a buttload of money, and desperate for love. He had hidden it well from Samantha over the years, and he had been into scamming women before he got married to Samantha. I went into shock completely and passed out. When I woke up, I was in the hospital with Maggie and the private investigator, and she knew not to call Edward at that point. Guys, I was asking so many more questions, and even though the private investigator did not want to strain me anymore, I insisted on knowing more. I didn't know what to do. Realizing that Edward was after my money enraged me. So I asked the PI if he knew who the women were, the other victims, and he said yeah, he does. He told me how much Edward took from these women and the names that he gave each of them. I asked the private investigator how he uncovered what Edward was into. He was hesitant to tell me, but I insisted after I showed the PI a picture of Edward. He started following for the better part of a few months. I guess he learned everything. According to him, he had watched Edward walk into a building he assumed was where he was staying when he wasn't around. After Edward left, he searched the apartment and found his computer. One thing about the PI I hired, he was apparently something good at hacking or unlocking all kinds of computers, I don't know. On it, he found records of a huge amount of money wired to multiple accounts across the country. He told me that he had copied what he found on a drive before he left the place, and he would not tell me anything beyond that. A tradesman never reveals his skills, and I tried my best to get more out of him, but it was near impossible. It was at that moment that I knew I had to expose Edward. It wasn't just for my sake anymore. At this point, I had to do it for the other women whose lives were ruined by Edward. Well, I left the hospital that day, and I told Maggie not to say anything to anyone because I didn't want Edward to know and then run away. I told Maggie I was going to continue with planning the wedding. She interrupted me, but I told her to let me explain myself. I was going to plan the wedding, but it wasn't going to be for me. It would be so that Samantha would know exactly who she had been married to. All I had to do was convince Samantha to show up. So I decided to meet Samantha, and I knew that it was the only way to make sure that we were both rid of Edward. I reached out to her and begged for a meeting. We met at a restaurant, and I told her everything that I found out. Samantha was heartbroken, to say the least, guys, and according to her, Edward had told her that he had a job that required him to travel all over the world. He traveled often and was not home much for most of their marriage. I told her how sorry I was that all of this was happening, but that Edward needed to be exposed, and thankfully she did not even need a lot of convincing. And guys, the plan was in motion. The wedding planning went on, and Edward knew nothing about Samantha being informed of what he has been doing. I didn't know really what to do or have much to worry about because Samantha wanted him to be exposed as well. They haven't met for a while now, so he's none the wiser, and the wedding is a month from now, and Edward and I have been going on with life like nothing is happening. It's been hard pretending that everything's fine, but, it's all good for a good cause. Update number 3. This is 2 weeks before the wedding. Hey, it's 2 weeks to the wedding, and I've tried to convince Edward to come to the wedding venue to check the sites, but he keeps telling me he doesn't have the time. That gave me enough time to finish the other part of the planning. After I left the venue, I went straight to the police station and reported a crime. Luckily, one of my friends was the head captain, and by the time I reported all my suspicions and findings, he was ready to have them arrested right away. However, I told him that I had a plan for Edward and begged him not to act at all on the time. I gave him the date and time of the wedding, and he said that he agrees he'll be there. But before that, he insisted on having Edward tailed, and I had no objection to it. The police needed to do their investigation as well, and then all was set. I informed Maggie exactly what I planned to do and told Samantha the same thing. They were both on board and understood Maggie's reason for understanding, and she is my best friend and she is by my side. I asked Samantha if she wanted to be present at the wedding, and she told us that Edward had married her and left her at home. Since she and Edward had been married, he was rarely home, and all she had done was try to love him. It hurts to see that she was bearing the burden of somebody like Edward, and she said that she wanted to go ahead, so I did not stop her from coming. Recently, Edward and I went out at his request, and while we were out eating, Edward asked me if we could open a joint account. I'm guessing that was his way of getting into the accounts of the other women he had scammed by getting married to them. He sounded forceful, and it probably meant that he was running out of time. I told him I would think about it, even though I know what's going on and what's going to happen in 2 weeks. I can't avoid what I need to do any longer. The next thing you'll be reading is everything that'll happen at the wedding. The hope is that it goes exactly according to my plans. Update number 4. Hey guys, it's me. I disappeared again because a lot have happened in the past week. Thank you for supporting and giving me kindness, and I do agree with a lot of you. Hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. So the wedding was finally here, and it was time to expose old Edward. The day before the wedding, Edward changed. It became so obvious that he was happy to be getting married, and I almost believed I was marrying somebody who truly loved me. But there was still Edward, the man who lied to me and was planning to run away with all of my money. I knew that I could not just let him get away from everything that he's done. So before I began to give you the account of what transpired on the day when I took my revenge, there's another shocking revelation that I have to let you guys in on. Do you remember that I was receiving anonymous text messages a few months ago, and they stopped as soon as I hired a PI to dig into Edward's character and background? Well, guess who was behind warning me about Edward? Yes, it was my best mate, Maggie. I could not be more grateful because she never left my sight. Recently, Maggie confessed to me that she was the one sending me anonymous text. The first time she texted because she had a bad feeling about Edward, but since I was so in love with that man, and I wasn't listening to anyone, Maggie had no choice but to make me aware to not rush into things through text messages. But later, she texted me because she had seen Edward with Samantha, and it was the first time she saw him with a woman wandering into a supermarket. Maggie gets suspicious, right? She texted me a few days later because she had a bad feeling that Edward was not what he was claiming to be, so she wanted to just warn me. But then she saw Edward with the same woman the second time, and since I didn't believe any of the text, she had reached out to me directly while I was in the office. Also, the text that I received while I was out with Maggie is a situation that is easy to explain. I received the text when Maggie went to use the washroom at a local restaurant, and when she returned I saw the text to her then. She acted surprised, so she asked me to give some thought to who might be the sender and to think of it as the sender's goodwill. Since everything is clear now, unless I forgot to mention something else or tie another knot together, let me start with the wedding blast itself. So, I did not mention that I had a few other women invited to the wedding as well, and I asked Samantha if she was okay with it. Apparently, she wanted nothing more than to see Edward exposed at this point. The wedding was finally here, and I could not put it off any longer. The venue was built in a way that many rooms could be left unseen if nobody wanted. Samantha was in one of those rooms, and Edward's previous victims were in another room. Here Comes the Bride was finally here, and it was not the same thing I had imagined my wedding to be. The police were mixed in the audience, so Edward had no idea they were even around, and my parents were around too, as expected. But I knew that I was not going to be married to Edward, and I had told Maggie that the best time to bring Samantha out was just as Edward thought that he had gotten away with scamming me. When my vows were about to be read, I started talking about how Edward made me happy and how I should be happy to spend the rest of my life with him. I told him how I was almost sorry to see him go. Maggie came outside with Samantha, and that was where it all burst. Edward was shocked to find Samantha there and tried to run away even. Yep, the officers did not waste time in swooping in to arrest Edward, and before they took him away, the other women came out, and dear Edward was so scared that he began to spill right there. He had gotten into scamming older women 9 years ago. Samantha was wrecked as she told him what a horrible man he was and how his parents would be extremely disappointed if they ever found out. Edward had lied about being estranged from his parents, and when he had introduced the two older women to them, in the space of 6 months they tried to caution him. He gets angry and never talked to them again. Edward was taken away, and a few days later the police told me of their findings, and also all the evidence I had from my PI came in handy for them. But they had to access Edward's computer themselves, where they found everything. Edward was swindling these women of almost $5 million US, and I knew I was saved from being the victim of fraud, but I still just lost it. I fell in love with somebody who was out to ruin me, and it looks like I'll be paying the price for a while. I heard yesterday that Samantha was filing divorce from Edward, and she had no reason to stay. I don't know much about how she's doing, but I promise to keep in touch. It's a good thing to fall in love, but please don't be like me and do it fast. I'm going to therapy now. I'm going to need a lot of it. Edward's being sued by all of the other women for fraud, and I'm suing for emotional distress. Let us just say a lot of legal fees are on his neck right now.